It's good to see all of you. Welcome. We are continuing in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 in our study of love, what love is and what love is not. I want to read 1 Corinthians 13 verses 4 through 7 again. It says, "Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth." Last week we spoke about how love is not rude, and we defined that. We looked at different translations and how it's looked at. And we also talked about how love does not insist on its own way. Well, this week I want to continue looking at this passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, the last half of verse 5, the last part of verse 5, where it says that it is not irritable or resentful. Love is not irritable or resentful. And so I'm going to look at this first one first. Of course, in this, the translation I used in this reading was English, the English Standard Version, where it's translated irritable. It's, of course, it was written in Greek, but it's translated into English in different ways, and of course, it all means the same thing. In other translations, it's translated as "love is not easily provoked," or "love is not provoked," depending on what translation you use. So it's not resentful, it's not easily provoked. The meaning is it's not, the meaning of this word irritable or not being provoked, it means it's not aroused to anger or irritated or provoked. Simple translation or a simple definition. It's not aroused to anger. We might describe somebody who is quick to anger as somebody who is irritable, as we might describe them as someone as having a short fuse or being hot-headed. We've used those words. Those are more common day words we use in today's society. So-and-so is hot-headed, or maybe it could be self-described. I am hot-headed, or so-and-so has a short fuse. When the Bible describes irritability here, he's saying that love is not irritable. And sometimes it helps by looking at the opposite of what love is, or the opposite of this word, irritable. So, in other words, love is slow to anger, and we see that both in the New Testament and in the Old Testament. It's really the opposite of being irritable or being provoked easily. It's slow to anger. God himself is described throughout the Old Testament several times as being slow to anger or slow to wrath. Really, wrath is that is the demonstration of anger, the releasing of anger. The following scriptures that we have here, it can give us some insight into what this word, what this means, or how God is described as being slow to anger. But as we look at these scriptures, these passages, I want you to notice the surrounding words, or not just focusing in on that God is slow to anger, but the other attributes of the Lord that are listed in conjunction with him being slow to anger. Because there's other godly qualities that are contrasted with anger throughout these verses. And I want to give you a handful of them. Beginning in Exodus, the first one in Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 and 7. And there's more context here, and I try not to take things out of context. That can be a challenge at times. But to describe the context of every one of these verses, it would take us several days. So I want to limit kind of, I don't know what that was. I guess I got too close to the microphone. Sorry about that. I don't know who was more scared, you or me. So here in Exodus, and I apologize. Here in Exodus chapter 34, Moses was asking God he wanted to see God's glory. And God said he was going to pass by him, but he wasn't to see his face because no man can see the face of God and live. So he was going to show him his back parts. He was going to pass before him, and then he was going to proclaim the glory of the Lord. And this is what the Lord said when he passed by Moses. He said, "The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and of the children's children to the third and fourth generation." Also in Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 17, this is Nehemiah giving somewhat of a recapitulation of what took place with the children of Israel coming out of Egypt, and really their rebellion, but God's response to the rebellion. Nehemiah 9, verse 17 said, "They refused to obey and were not mindful of the wonders that you performed among them, but they stiffened their neck and appointed a leader to return to their slavery in Egypt. But you are a God ready to forgive, gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, and did not forsake them." So that was God's response to their rebellion. And if you're familiar with the account of the children of Israel coming out of Egypt, they wandered around in the wilderness for 40 years, and then they were brought into the promised land, the land of Canaan, which God promised them, which is part of where Israel is today. But all throughout their journeyings, their wandering in the wilderness, and especially when they first came out, they enjoyed this great deliverance out of slavery and bondage, but their hearts quickly turned back to Egypt because it was difficult out there in the wilderness. And God described them as stiffening their neck. He said they appointed a leader to return into the slavery of Egypt instead of trusting in the Lord. And yet through all of that, God was ready to forgive. He was gracious and merciful, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, and did not forsake them. Psalm 103, verse 8, it says, "The Lord is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love." Joel chapter 2, verse 13 says, "Return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, and he relents over disaster." So there's a phrase here that's repeated over and over, while God is being described as slow to anger, and perhaps you see the repetition, that the Lord is merciful and he's gracious, and he's abounding in steadfast love. And there's a reason why these are coupled together, because they're all related one with another. Being gracious and merciful, goes along with being slow to anger. He is merciful, it says, which means he's full of mercy. Mercy is withholding harm or punishment when it is within one's power to do so. In other words, having compassion. That's what mercy is. Now, when it's related to justice, we've done wrong or someone has done wrong. You think about someone who's broken the law, committed a crime, they've been tried, they've been convicted for their offense, and the judge has the power to enact judgment, to bring down a sentence upon the guilty party. And sometimes the guilty party can cry out for mercy, whereas the offending party, the transgressor, has already been convicted and knows that the judgment is due, and yet they cry out for mercy, and the judge has the prerogative to lighten the sentence or dismiss the charges or let them go free or enact the most severe judgment in accordance with the law. So mercy is withholding something, that judgment or harm towards somebody, toward another. Of course, it can be done in unjust situations, but let's continue on here for now. Being merciful is having compassion. Having compassion. Similar to the blind men that cried out to Jesus. They said, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." They were asking for mercy. And Jesus stopped in his place and he had compassion on them. Now, I don't know if it says specifically that he had compassion, but his actions showed his compassion. In other places it talks about how Jesus had compassion. Like when he fed the 5,000 or the 4,000. He had compassion on them and he fed them because he didn't want to send them away hungry. He's slow to anger. He also says, it also says that he's gracious. To be gracious or full of grace, it means to show favor. And, of course, it's unmerited favor. That's what grace is. It's unearned favor. And it's similar to mercy, or it's really kind of like the opposite in a way, but they're all both positive things. Where grace is something that's given that we didn't deserve, we didn't earn. Something good that comes toward, or something good that comes our way. Like salvation, for example. Like Jesus coming to save us and to die for us. It was provided by God's grace. His mercy withheld judgment, but his grace provided salvation that we didn't earn, we didn't deserve. Not a single soul deserves to be saved. And yet God extends his hand of mercy in one hand, and in the other hand, if you will, he extends grace, that gift of life. So he withholds judgment, and then he gives us something that we never earned or deserved. So he's full of mercy. He's merciful and gracious. He's slow to anger. So when we look at these attributes of God and how they're coupled together, and how they relate one to another, and we look at it in relation to this idea of love not being irritable, we can conclude that being short-fused or hot-headed or irritable, it points to a deficit in mercy and grace. So if one finds themselves on a short fuse or just getting angry very easy, it points to that deficit, that need for more mercy and for more grace. And there's more here. I want I want to go to the book of Proverbs next. So that was those Old Testament scriptures, those were describing God, characteristics of God. And God, as the Bible, His Word describes, God is love. And so He is our example. We are to love like He loves. Jesus told us, commanded us, that we are to love one another as He loves us. And so that is our example. We want to love one another just like He loves us. But the book of Proverbs, it shows us some great wisdom in being slow to anger. And again, we want to look at the surrounding context here surrounding this idea of being slow to anger. So the first one we want to look at is Proverbs chapter 14, verse 29. It says, whoever is slow to anger has great understanding, but he who has a hasty temper exalts folly or foolishness. Whoever is slow to anger has great understanding, but he who has a hasty temper exalts folly or lifts up folly. Proverbs chapter 15, verse 18, it says, a hot-tempered man stirs up strife. That's fighting. But he who is slow to anger quiets contention. This reminded me of another verse in Proverbs, same chapter, verse 1, which I'll share in just a moment, but it's really a contrast to the hot-tempered man, because the hot-tempered man has very little self-control. Like we said, a short fuse. I remember kind of a silly example of a short fuse, but I remember when I was probably a teenager, I was over at a friend's house, and he had a bunch of Black Cat firecrackers, and he'd light them up and just toss them in the air one at a time and watch them pop. But if you're familiar with firecrackers, they have different types of fuses. You have the green ones that are kind of slow burning, and then you have the little paper gray ones, if you've seen those. They burn really fast, and typically those ones are, it's kind of, you have one green fuse and you have a bunch of them that are all tied together with those paper ones. And so when you light it, it sounds like a machine gun going off. Well, if you take it apart, you can light each individually. And so, of course, I thought it was pretty cool. This guy's popping them out of, throwing them, lighting them in his hand. And so I took one, and as soon as I lit it, pop, right in my hand. Big old water blister on my thumb. But it was like, that's how it is with a short-tempered person. A short-tempered person. It burns, it's really, it surprises us, and it burns us, and it leaves a mark. That verse I was going to reference is verse 1, Proverbs 15, verse 1, because it contrasts that hot-tempered man who explodes on such short notice with very little self-control. Proverbs 15:1, it says, a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. So that when we contrast that with having that short fuse, that lack of self-control, the one that has that lack of self-control loses control also of their words and stirs up that strife. And so the opposite of that would be a soft answer. And that soft answer turns away wrath. How quickly can things escalate when heads are butting, they can escalate rather quickly. But when one person stands up and says, I'm going to offer a soft answer or be apologetic, even if we don't feel like we're completely in the wrong, we may feel like we're right, but sometimes that soft answer that's offered turns away wrath. Matthew chapter 5, verse 9, Jesus said, Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. Really showing the opposite of the hot-tempered man that stirs up strife. Jesus shares about being a peacemaker instead. Bringing people together, having that ministry as the Bible speaks of, I believe it's in Romans, that ministry of reconciliation, bringing things together, having that desire for harmony one with another. Proverbs chapter 16, verse 32 says, Whoever is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit, that's his own spirit, he who rules his own spirit than he who takes a city. So it describes the power or the might, the power of the one who is slow to anger, the one who can rule over his own spirit, the one who has that self-control. And we absolutely at times, there's things that are triggering. There's things that can stir us up. There's things that can maybe push a button, and it can trigger something on the inside that stirs up some type of anger. But it's in those moments where we have to enact that self-control that comes from the Spirit of God, which we'll look at in just a moment. But we bring those feelings, that anger into subjection to the Spirit of God. And really yield ourselves to God's Spirit to answer or to respond in the right way, as opposed to losing control. I used to work as a painter, paint houses and mainly houses, sometimes some commercial buildings. But this was right after I got out of the Marine Corps, and there was this one guy I worked with, and he was, I don't know, he'd been painting a few years longer than I had, and I was just a new green guy and didn't know anything about painting. And but he was always just irritated with me for some reason. I couldn't really figure it out. He just seemed like that's how he was with everyone. But I'd be painting a wall or I'd be painting something, and I remember one time he was just so annoyed at how slow I was working, and I was, in my opinion, I was working fast. He's like, "Here, give me that." He just ripped the paint roller out of my hand. He was like, "Here, this is how you do it. See, it's not that hard." He had a short fuse. He was always getting upset, and just it was one of those things where you felt like you had to walk on eggshells. And then at a certain, I confronted him several times, but anyway, relive it. Just losing self-control. I kind of lost where I was going with that, but he said, "Whosoever is slow to anger is better than the mighty." These mighty warriors that can go out into battle. But if we have control over our own spirit, he said, we are better than the mighty. Or he who is slow to anger is better than the mighty. Proverbs 25, verse 28 says, "A man without self-control is like a city broken down, are broken into and left without walls. A man without self-control is like a city broken into and left without walls. No defenses, very unstable, vulnerable. So we ask the question, how do we counteract irritability when we find it within ourselves? Because there are times, just like anything, any sin, we can struggle with. And we need to be able to recognize it in ourselves and be able to know how to address it when we find anything ungodly within us. So how do we counteract it? Well, Proverbs 19, verse 11 addresses this very thing. How do we become slow to anger? He said, good sense makes one slow to anger, and it is his glory to overlook an offense. In other words, having an understanding. Having an understanding. Good sense. Understanding the matter, what's going on. Investigating. Being introspective. Analytical. Understanding why am I this way, or why is that person that way, and understanding. He said it is his glory to overlook an offense. Sometimes things are not worth addressing. Sometimes things are worth overlooking. We would say it, we could put it this way. It's not really the best way to phrase it, but when we talk about choosing our battles, or choosing what hill we're going to die on, so to speak. Again, for a lack of a better term. Some things we should just be willing to let go. It is his glory to overlook an offense. James chapter 1, verses 19 through 21. He said, know this, my beloved brothers. Let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. For the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. In the King James it says the wrath of man works not the righteousness of God. The anger of man. Now anger has a purpose, but when anger is misapplied, if anger is escalated beyond what it's intended, then it does not produce the righteousness of God. He tells us to be quick to hear. Many times, what solves the situation is to listen. He said, therefore put away all filthiness and rampant wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word which is able to save your souls. So we have a responsibility to control ourselves. And again, we ask the question, how do we do that? How do we do that? Because we want to be pleasing to God. We want to be obedient. We want to live this life of love that's described in 1 Corinthians 13. We don't want these negative attributes in our lives. So how do we grow from them? And the answer is very simple. Doesn't mean it's easy, but it's simple. And that's found in Galatians chapter 5. And that's by walking in the Spirit, or walking by the Spirit. Being led of the Spirit, the Holy Spirit. Before we came to Christ, we didn't have a whole lot of self-control. But when we come to Jesus, when Jesus comes and abides in us, he begins to teach us and guide us and lead us, and we listen to a new voice. We no longer listen to the voice of our flesh. He said, lean not into your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your path. But we're definitely not perfect in every way overnight. And that's part of what the Bible describes as sanctification, of being made holy. It's a lifelong process that God leads us through. We're justified instantly when we believe in Jesus. But sanctification, although there is an immediate sanctification, there is a lifelong process. That means there's going to be areas in our lives where we need to improve. We need to repent. We need to grow. And how do we do that? By walking in the Spirit. Galatians 5:16. He said, walk by the Spirit and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. The same chapter talks about the works of the flesh. Adultery, fornication, all these different things. And among that list is fits of anger. So work of the flesh. He said, but the fruit of the Spirit. And he's juxtaposing these two things. The works of the flesh, that which is natural, that which is against God, that which comes from the fallen nature of man, versus the fruit of the Spirit, that which is not worked for. And it's important to realize that. It's produced by connection with Christ. He said the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness. And the last thing that he lists here is self-control. Fruit of the Spirit is self-control. He said, against such there is no law. How do we grow in the area of irritability? Walking in the Spirit. I want to be really quick here and just address this last thing he shared here in verse 5. 1 Corinthians 13. Right? How he says love is not resentful. Actually, no, I'm going to stop right here. We'll look at that, Lord willing, next week. If you will, please come to the music.